What's up everyone, welcome back to the series. In this video we're going to be continuing from where I stopped. I decided to save time by implementing some features of the application of the recording. So what happened was I happened to add more features to the application, but these features would make the playlist longer and they had more CRUD than other features, and therefore I decided to skip those, but I'll include them in the source code as well as on the course website, which I will update later. So what we have are some new API endpoints, and those are for our tags as well as our reviews, just like you see right here. So what we did was to add some CRUD for the tags. So each book is going to be identified by some tags, and these tags can be shared across other books. So that's a many-to-many relationship between our books as well as our tags. We also included reviews routes. In the previous video, we ended from where we added the review to a book. So for now, we're going to resume from where we stopped. But in this video, we're going to be looking at error handling and how we can customize errors on our FastAPI application. So to begin, I'm going to go to our code right here, and we're going to be checking out some of the changes that have been introduced. So I'll go to our routes for tags, and this is basically what we have. They are just endpoints to handle the CRUD that's associated with tags. So that includes adding tags to a book, deleting a tag, editing a tag, and so on. We also created a service class for those tags, so that's where the whole CRUD action happens. And then we also went ahead and updated our schemas for books so that a book can be returned with both its reviews and its list of tags. So if you go ahead and make that request in here, if I go to our books and try to get a book by its ID, we can now see that each book is being returned with the reviews on that book as well as the tags. So the book can have the Python tag as well as the API tag, but there can exist other books that can also have that specific tag. So I thought I could just skip including that in the series to make the playlist shorter, but a more detailed explanation is going to be found on the course website. So now that we've been able to look at that, let us look at error handling. So for now, we have our simple application, and all it does is to make use of the default error handling that FastAPI does. So for example, if we try to get a route that does not exist in any of our paths, we shall get a simple not found. So these errors can be just enough for any client to consume, but there may be scenarios in which you may want to go ahead and provide more detail about what caused the error and what a user needs to do. And that's where custom error handling comes in. So FastAPI has a very nice way of helping us to handle errors that exist within our application, but it also provides us the ability to go ahead and customize our error handling, just like we're going to see in this video. So if we to look into our dependencies for the authentication, we realize that we are raising our exceptions using the default HTTP exception class. This can be enough for us to throw our exceptions, but there may be scenarios in which, let's say, we want our code base to be maintainable, and let's say we want to be specific about which error occurs and when it occurs. So this can be very important for people who are going to maintain our code base in the future, as they will know the different types of errors, what they stand for, and what actions can be taken. So for example, in case we have an error such as the one to show that a token is invalid, we can create an exception class for that error so that users can be able to know the exact error that happened, but also the backend user or the backend programmer will know when to raise a specific error and at which time to raise that specific error. So let us get started implementing that. So to start, we're going to go within our source folder, and we shall create a new folder. Actually, it's going to be a new module or file. So this is going to be called errors.py. So inside our errors.py, we are going to create our exception classes, and these exception classes are going to be raised in case a specific error that arises from our app is raised. So there may be those errors that are going to be general, such as the not found error that we've looked at and the internal server error that we incur every time we get an error. So there may also be those errors that are going to arise due to user actions. Things like, let's say, someone trying to access an endpoint for which they do not have a permission. We can have a specific error for that, and that's what we're going to be doing. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and first of all create our class. So this is going to be our base class for all our exceptions that are going to arise within our app. So these are errors or exceptions that are specific to our application. So we're going to call this the bookly error or the bookly exception. Let me just name this the bookly exception. And once I've been able to do that, then I'm going to make this to be a subclass of our default exception class that Python provides. So all errors or all custom errors that we're going to define are going to be made from this default exception class, which is our bookly class. So you can also add a new docstring right here, and this docstring can be one to explain that this is the base class for all exceptions specific to our app. So you can just come right here and say this is the default, or let's say this is the base class for all bookly exceptions or bookly errors. And once we are done doing that, then we can go ahead and notice the different parts where we need to define an error and what that error can be or how it can be raised. So for example, if we went back to our dependencies right here, you can notice that we have that error that we are throwing in case someone tries to access an endpoint with an invalid token, one that has errors or one that is expired. So what we can do is to go ahead and define that as an exception of its own. So I can come right here, and what I'll do is to just copy what we have, though in this case this is going to be invalid token. So we can name this error invalid token, and what this is going to be a subclass of our bookly error. So I'll go ahead and fix this, and here we shall have bookly exception. So this is going to be an error, but we need to change how we are defining it here. So instead of showing this as the documentation for this class, we can just say that user has provided an invalid or expired token. And once that is done, this is just enough for us to have that error. So what we can do where we need to raise that error is to just come and import it. So you can just come right here and say from source.errors, we can go ahead and import so for our case, we're going to have a bunch of errors, but for my case, I'm going to import the invalid token error. And once we've imported that invalid token error, instead of raising this entire HTTP exception, we can go ahead and simply raise that invalid token. So we can just come right here and say raise invalid token. And just like you see right here, it's going to be showing the programmer who will be maintaining our code. Now, this is the exception that we're going to raise in case someone has provided a token that has been expired or is invalid. So that's just enough for us to do that. Now we also have the one for a revoked token. We can just simply go ahead and do that. I'll just copy and paste and then edit this. So, and I'm going to speed code through this so that we can save time during the video. But you're going to see how these are all going to come up. So now that we've been able to define our exceptions, let us go ahead and replace the different HTTP exceptions we raise with our custom exception classes. So when you go back to our dependencies, I'm going to go ahead and update our code so that it makes use of those classes we've created. So we're going to begin by importing all of them. I'll begin with importing the refresh token required, and therefore we have imported them. So to begin, we shall start with where we have our invalid token error. So shall just come right here and say that we are going to raise invalid token, and this will show that the user has provided an invalid or expired token. Then we're going to do the same thing for where we want to provide an access token. So we shall just come right here and say raise, and in this case we shall raise access token required. So this shall show that the user has provided a refresh token when an access token is needed. And then for the case of the refresh token, here we shall say raise refresh token required, and that will be the exception. Now the last exception that we are remaining with is one for raising an error in case someone tries to access an endpoint with the wrong role or with the role that is not allowed to perform that action. So in this case, we can raise the error, which is going to be our insufficient permission. So just like you can see, user does not have the necessary permissions to perform an action. And that is just how we're going to be playing around with those custom exceptions. So we're going to do the same thing for the rest of the errors. So just in case we go, let's say, to our service classes, we can now be in position to go ahead and replace some of those exceptions. So if I go to our auth routes, I can simply go ahead and raise an error for this. So in case we have that, we can just say from, so we already have our source errors, and then we shall get the, so in this case we can use the user already exists, user not found. Then you can also get insufficient, or actually that's going to be invalid credentials. I don't think I created the exception for that, but when you go back here, we can still be able to create it. So I can come right here, user already exists, that exists. So I can simply copy this and I create the exception for the invalid credentials. So in here, we can simply create a class. So this can be invalid credentials. And this can be user providing an email or password during sign up that is invalid. So here we can say invalid credentials where so here we can say user has provided wrong email or password during login. So that's what we can go ahead and show it, but you can feel free to write whatever you want. So for our case, we can just raise invalid credentials. When I go back here, I can still go ahead and import invalid credentials, and that will basically cover that. So if we go back right here, we can just come and say user already exists, which we already created. So we can just come and raise that exception by saying if user exists, then we shall raise user already exists, the exception for showing that the user with that email already exists. Then we can do the same thing for logging in case someone provides invalid credentials. We can just raise the invalid credentials error. So we can just come right here and raise invalid credentials, and that will be the one that will be raised. So we have other errors, invalid or expired token. I think we created a class for that, and that class is going to be the one for invalid token. So if we want to go ahead and customize that, or we can just come right here, and instead of raising this, we can simply go ahead and say raise invalid token. Then I think that will be it for now. Maybe for other places where we have book not found, I think that's going to be in our service books class. And where we have that, we can simply go ahead and, I don't think we have an exception being raised in our book service, but I think that exists within our book routes. So when you go within our book routes, we have parts where we are always raising those exceptions. For example, book not found. So we created an exception for that. If I go back to source.errors, I can just say from source.errors, we can go ahead and import the book not found exception, and then we can simply raise that every time we want to raise the book not found exception. So in this case, we can say raise book not found, and that will be the exception that is being returned. And even here, we can simply raise book not found, and that will be enough for us to raise that exception. So once you've been able to do that, then you can also do the same thing here, and that will be it for our book routes. So once that is done, I think we are now remaining with our tags. So these are the routes for tags. In our tags, we have our routes. So within our routes, we do not have any place where we are raising exceptions, but we can go to our service, and I think that's where we went ahead and raised the exceptions. For example, where the book does not exist and where the tag does not exist. So we can go ahead and simply raise those and basically reduce on the amounts we are raising those HTTP exceptions. So if I come right here, I can say from, in this case, we can just import source.errors and then import book not found and then tag not found. And when you get those, we can simply go ahead and raise them. So for example, here we have tag not being found, so we can just come right here and say raise tag not found, and we can simply go at the top right here, and when you see that the book is not found, you can just raise book not found. And then we can actually create the one for the tag already existing. So when someone tries to create a tag that is already existing, we just throw that error showing them that they cannot create the tag again. So if we go back to our, that's going to be errors, we can simply go ahead and try to create that. So can just come right here and say that this is going to be our class, and this class is going to be one for our tag exists. So I can just come right here and name this tag already exists. And then we can just come right here and say tag already exists. So let us go ahead and import that within our service. So I'll come at the top right here and then import tag already exists. So once I have imported it, I can finally raise it here by just saying tag already exists. Once that is done, we can now go ahead and look at how we can return these responses with those exceptions. So keep in mind that each time we use the HTTP response, the HTTP exception class, we are basically creating an exception as well as returning a status or a response for that exception. So that allows us to set the status code as well as the detail of that. But for us to go ahead and register our custom exceptions as exceptions that can be used by FastAPI, we need to go ahead and create what is called an exception handler. So an exception handler is going to be a function that FastAPI will use to customize the response that is going to be returned each time we get to raise an exception. So think about our bookly exception class right here. This is a Python exception, not a valid response that FastAPI can return. So if we see wherever we've raised our exceptions, we have gone ahead and raised exceptions and not responses. So this is supposed to return errors of some sort. So for us to handle that, we are going to go within our errors. I'm going to create a function right in here, and this function is going to be called create exception handler. You can call it create error handler or whatever you prefer. So this is going to take in the status code, which is the status code we expect to return with the response once an exception has been raised. So for example, we can say that our status code is going to be an integer. Now this can be error 500 or 403 forbidden or 404 not found, whatever that may be. Then we are going to also return a message with that specific response or the detail of that specific exception. So the detail, we are simply going to just create an initial detail, and the initial detail is going to be anything. It can be a string, it can be a dictionary. So I'm just going to use Python's any type. To use that, I'm going to go at the top of our code right here, and I'll say from typing, we shall go ahead and import any. But with that, we shall also import the callable, because we're going to be returning a function, which is the error handler that we've created. And once we've been able to do that, I'll just go down here, and then I'll say that our initial detail is going to be any. But we expect this function to return a callable, which is going to be the error handler function. So I'm just simply going to come and say that this is going to return a callable. Now this callable is going to be a function, and the first thing we need to provide in here is going to be the parameters that this is going to take in. So the first parameter is going to be the request object. So we need to go ahead and import the request type. So I'll come right here and say from FastAPI.requests. So this is going to be requests. Shall import the requests class, and then we shall also import the JSON response class, which is the response that we're going to return in our exception handler. So this is going to be responses. Once that is done, we shall come right here, and all we do is to go ahead and specify. So one thing we're going to have is the callable that's going to take in the request, which is our request object, and then this will also take in the exception. So FastAPI exception handlers are going to take in two parameters, the first one being the request and then the second one being the exception. But since we've created our exception, you can go ahead and basically provide our exception in here. So this can be an exception object. And then the return of this, sorry for this mistake. So here we expect to return to basically provide an exception and then return a JSON response. So we shall say that it will return a JSON response. Now, once we are done with this, we can now go ahead and simply create our error handler. So the error handler is going to be a function, and this function is going to be one that is going to be returned by this function. But that is what we are actually going to add to FastAPI to allow us to customize how we are returning an error. So to do that, we are going to go ahead and set the error handler up, which is our function. So we're going to define that with async, and this is going to be our error handler. So we can just call this our exception handler, or whatever you want to call it. So this, just like I explained, will take in the request, which is going to be of type request, and then it will take in the response, and actually not the response, but rather the exception. So our exception in this case is going to be of type exception, but remember we have our bookly exception that we've created right here. So that's what we're going to pass in there. Once that is done, now I notice that I have a habit of forgetting that this is an async function. So I'll say async def, and then we shall provide our exception handler. Then right after doing that, I'll just come right here and return a JSON response. So this is going to be the message that's going to be returned for each response we shall return for these errors. Now in our case, we are just going to come right here, and the first thing we have to provide is going to be the content. So this content is going to be whatever we shall put in our initial detail. So if it's a dictionary, that's what will be returned. And then we shall have our status code. So our status code in this case is going to be the status code that we're going to provide in here. So I'll come right here and say that our status code is going to be our status code. Now remember that this create exception handler class is supposed to create an exception handler given the status code as well as the initial detail. But you're going to see how we shall attach all that to these custom exception classes that we've created. So after doing this, we need to go ahead and return the exception handler. So shall just come and say return, and this will return our exception handler. So once we've been able to import, or once we've been able to return our exception handler, let us now go ahead and look at how we can attach our exception handler functions to our newly created custom exceptions that we have right here. So to do that, we're going to go within our Danda init in our source folder. And the first thing we're going to do is to import all the exception classes as well as the create exception handler function that we've created. So I'm going to do that by saying from source, or from .error, since we are in the same folder, we can go ahead and import our, so in this case, I'll just use these brackets, and then I'll So we shall also go ahead and import a user not found, revoked token, and so on and so forth. So once we've been able to import these errors, we're now going to go ahead and attach them to our application using our app instance that we created right here. So using this FastAPI app instance, we are going to go ahead and access a method that's going to register each of the custom error handler classes that we've created onto an exception handler, just like we've created this function right here. So to do that, we are simply going to go ahead and basically create our first or attach our first custom error exception class to our FastAPI app. So to do that, we shall say add app or app dot add, and in this case we shall call our add exception handler method. So this is going to take in the exception class or the status code of the exception that we want to handle. For our case, we shall just come right here and say that our first one is going to be user not found, or let's say user already exists. Then we need to go ahead and provide the handler or the function that's going to handle that specific exception. So for our case, we have this create exception handler function that is going to take in the status code and the detail of whatever happened that we want to return within our response. So to do that, I'm just simply going to come right here and say that our status code is going to be, so for this case, we can raise maybe a 403 forbidden error. So we're going to be making use of FastAPI status module. I'll import that. And once I've imported that, I'll come right here and say that we're going to make use of status.http 403 forbidden. And then we have to provide our detail. So our detail for our case can be something like, let's say, our initial detail is going to be a dictionary, and this dictionary is going to have the information or the message that we want to return to the user. So for our case, our message is going to be user with email already exists, and then we can go ahead and also provide an error code. So these error codes can be used to further describe these errors. Let's say our API has a documentation page on a certain website. We can go ahead and add these error codes that are going to be just descriptions to just show the client what exactly happened. So in case front-end developers are working with our API, using our error codes, they can be sure of what happened. So for our case, we can just provide these as snake case characters or snake case strings. So we can just say something user exists, and then they'll be able to know that they are trying to create a user with an email that is already existing within our application. So this is just also important. So once we've done this, I'm going to go ahead and speed code this for the rest of the error classes or the error exception classes that we created. So I'm going to begin with the ones that are not existing. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this. And just like that, we've been able to set up custom error handlers for our custom exception classes that we have done. So to test this, we are going to go ahead and try to access different endpoints, throwing different exceptions, and we shall see how those are going to work. So hoping that our server is running, of which it is, we are now going to go to our response right here. So if we try to make a request for a book, so inside here we're trying to get a book by its ID. If we send this, we now see that our custom message is being returned, the one for the token being invalid. So let's try to provide one for let's say the book not being found. If I try to get a new pair of tokens, I'll try to provide, let's say, the refresh token instead of the access token. So for our case, if I try to make that request with a refresh token instead of an access token, we shall now see that our custom error is being returned, the one for providing a valid access token. So I'll provide a new access token. And in this case, if we try to go and get the book by its ID, we shall now see that we can be able to return the book. But let's say we are to return the book and the book does not exist. So what I'll do is to just go ahead and update this UID to something like this. We shall now see that our book is not found and our custom message is the one that's being returned. So if we try to, let's say, throw some exceptions, for example, try to throw an error inside here. Let's try to throw an error inside any route in here. So if you go back to our code, we can throw an exception to just make sure that we get an error, and then we see what we can do about that. So for example, I can go to our route that retrieves a book by its ID. which is this. So I can go ahead and maybe say print, let's say n divided by 0. So if we try to make this request again, we shall see that we have that internal server error, which is a very weird one, and it's being returned in a way that you don't want. So one of the ways we can fix this is by basically setting up an error handler for it. So if you go back to our source init.py, we can create an error handler for the 500 internal server error so that we return errors in the way we want. So to do that, we can just go ahead and now we can create a function or an error handler for that, which is not going to be in the format we've done right here. So FastAPI also allows you to create a decorator from the app instance that is going to mark the function as an error handler or an exception handler. And in here, what you need to do is to provide the status code. So I'll go ahead and provide the status code, or you can even go ahead and provide error classes such as the ones that we've been able to create right here. So we can go ahead and say async def, and then this will take in a request, and then it will take in an exception. So for our case, we are going to have an exception, which is going to be our AXC. So we are supposed to name this, so I'll just go ahead and call this internal server error. And this is going to be how we're going to create our error handler. So just like we did for the previous example where we created this error handler function, we can simply go ahead and return our error handler, or simply create our error handler to return a JSON response. So I'll go ahead and import the JSON response class from FastAPI.responses. I'll go ahead and say that we're going to import our JSON response. Once we've imported JSON response, we can now come right here and also go ahead and fix how we basically wrote this. So our detail can be something like, or our content. So we can have a message. And for our case, this message can be something as simple as, oops, something went wrong. And then you can also create an error code for that. So you can come right here. Let me format this a little bit. So you can come here and provide our error code as server error. And then you can go ahead and document that. So our status code in this case is going to be the status dot. In this case, we can come and say status.http 500 internal server error, which is going to be the one that will be returned. So in this case, if we make that request, we shall see that our response is being returned as that. So we can go ahead and handle your errors and customize your errors using this technique, and you can be able to pretty much customize them to what you may need or what suits you best. In this video, we've been able to look at how we can handle errors in a FastAPI application. We started by looking at how we could create custom error handlers or custom error classes that could then register onto our app using custom error handlers. I hope you've enjoyed and learned from this video. If you've done so, please leave a like. Do not forget to share this video with whom it may be helpful. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're new. Consider subscribing to my Patreon or becoming a member of this channel, as that will help me be able to carry on creating this content. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.